And if there's no other business then, Robin, would you like to introduce our speaker?
Sure, I'd love to. So Dr. Hannes Gerhardt is a professor in the Department of Geosciences at the University of West Georgia. He co-authored the book, Contesting the Arctic Politics and Contesting the Arctic, Politics and Imaginaries in the Circumpolar North. Dr. Gerhardt's research interests include issues of sovereignty, territorialization, global governmental mentality, and the cultural dimensions of critical geopolitics. Dr. Gerhardt gave some information on Facebook about Carroll County and about how the voting, the registering to vote increased, and how some statistics. And so I asked him to speak today. And so we're glad to have him. He has spoken with Great Decisions before and is interested in and is experienced in and knowledgeable about a variety of topics. So welcome, Dr. Gerhardt, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I clearly need to revamp my research interests to make them a little bit more accessible, I think. It might be that that's a little bit of an older version, but yeah, I think that would make sense. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I was asked to come in to talk a little bit about the election, and then Robin also asked whether I could say a little bit about what happens when elections are contested, as we've seen in this election cycle. So I have to say right off the bat, I mean, I'm not an expert in this. I'm not, for example, a legal scholar when it comes to contested elections. There is a field in geography known as electoral geographies. Not something that I've really delved into. Mostly I've been pursuing this as a hobby, but I really do like statistics and I like digging into numbers. And so that's something that I've done and shared some of it on Facebook. And so Robin was like, well, why don't you share that with the group? So I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint that I created because I think that a lot of this information is really best kind of made sense of visually. So let me try to pull that up. Does everyone see that? Yeah, it's good.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So I'm going to review the general election, just some of the statistics that I focused on, and then I'll spend the latter half of my time talking about this thing really of the contested election, where we've, at least I have for the first time, really dug into the guts of how the Electoral College works, and it was a little bit frightening to see, in a sense, the amount of loopholes, I guess, or the fact that the popular vote is not de facto something that is necessarily accepted. It is, I think, in the end, but we'll dig into that a little bit. So first of all, some of the statistics I found. So digging into it, in Georgia, the percent of eligible of the population that was registered in 2016 to 2020, I thought this was interesting. It didn't go up that much. It was only up by about 1%, and it's still very high. There's a lot of the population that's registered, and so the explanation for why the registration numbers didn't go up significantly, even though there were significant efforts in trying to get more people registered, I think has to do with the fact that there was a purge of voters, of non-active voters between 2016 and 2018. And so as I point out here, and you'll see in a second, that these non-active voters, they went down from about 1.2 million to 500,000 between 2016 and 2018. And so nonetheless, voter turnout was significantly higher this time around than it was last time, about 5%. Here you see this is directly from the Secretary of State and their official numbers of registered voters. And you see that they had these inactive voters over a long time, and they just kind of kept whittling them down, I think, as they were being purged. And so by the 2018 election, we had a relatively much smaller number of inactive voters. And so the fact, going back that the registration still went up that's the effort of trying to get more people registered, and those then turned out to be active voters. Total registered in 2020, according to the Secretary of State, is a little bit north of 7 million. Some of the newspapers reported it was 7.6 million, but this is the official number that I could find. So how did people vote? This was a topic that a lot of people were interested in and spoke about. Obviously, it changed because there were more efforts made to making mail-in ballots accessible to the voters. And so you see that the actual number of mail-in ballots, the blue, increased significantly. And this is partly because it was made more accessible, partly because people were concerned about about COVID. And so you see that that did increase significantly, and day of voters was significantly down. If you compare it to who voted that way, this is really something that we see across the entire nation, that the Trump voters the Republican voters tended to not rely on the mail-in voting as much as the Democratic voters, but still you can see that that some of them did in fact make use of that. So you see that kind of breakdown here. Interestingly, the early voting, was is really the preferred way of voting in Georgia, and that's not the way it is in all states. For example, in Pennsylvania, they have a long tradition of voting the day of, and so that was why Pennsylvania was so much in the headlines, that so many people were now not voting day of and voting mail-in. Okay, so if we actually start looking at how people voted and breaking this down a little bit, I have to immediately say that there's a caveat here that I don't have all of the data. So the Secretary of State, they have not released the demographic data on the demographics of the final vote. So all that I could get my hands on was the early vote. But to show that the early vote is tells you a lot about basically how people vote, you can see this comparison from 2016. That if you look at the people that early vote and then the total tally, if you include then the people that vote day of, it doesn't change that much. Among Black voters, it barely changes at all. White voters, it goes up a little bit. So there's a bigger group coming out during election day, and it goes down a little bit for this other group, which I'll talk about here in a second. But this is mostly just to show that there is really a lot of information by just looking at the early numbers, which is all that I have access to. So looking at those early numbers, then we can compare the 2016 to 2018 numbers. And what we see is really that the amount of, this is for all of Georgia now. This is not Carroll County only, this is all of Georgia. And we see that, among Black voters, it was pretty steady. White voters went down a little bit. Hispanic voters went up almost by a percentage, but really what I thought was maybe the most significant was this other group, where you kind of make up that difference between the white voters and the going down, and something has to go up. And so partly Hispanic, but really here this other group. And other refers to biracial or people that don't want to identify their race, or included in this one is Asian. Asian is actually a separate group, but the way that they do the statistics, it was just easier to throw them together here so I can make the comparison. So this includes Asian as well. And that number went up quite a bit in 2020. Comparing this to demographics of Georgia, there is a connection between what we've seen over 2016, 2020 in general demographic trends. The white population is decreasing a little bit in terms of its percentage. Black population more or less staying steady. Hispanic population growing a little bit, Asian population growing a little bit. But if you add these together, that makes up for that difference. The thing is that when they ask white, white, do you consider yourself white? Whoops, I'm sorry, I just hit my my thing here. Let me see. Let me start over. Okay. When they ask about the white population, they don't make a distinction necessarily between whether you're Hispanic or not. So if you take the Hispanic out of that, you find that the population of basically non-Hispanic white has been going down. So this is based on the Census Bureau's 2010 census and their estimations of what things are and what things were in 2019. And so you do see that there's been a decline there, which could be reflected in the election results. And of course, when you look at the voting preferences, this is as per the CNN exit polls. You see that the white demographic group generally prefers Republicans and went for Donald Trump, not quite in the same numbers as they did in 2016. And so that would obviously make a difference if there are fewer of them. So what about age? Age is, of course, something that was talked about a lot, whether the young people would show up. It would be important because you see that younger people tend to vote more Democratic, older people tend to vote more Republican. And so what we saw in Georgia is that this is again based on exit polls from CNN. So, they're not perfect, but I think that this is a general trend. You see that the young vote did in fact increase in Georgia a good bit in 2020, where you have an increase of almost 4%, 3.5%. And the population of 45 and older went down also. So there's certainly something to be seen there. One of the things I forgot to mention actually with this other group, is that I put the Asian groups in there. Asian, let me see if I go back. No, I can't find it here. Asian population is only 4.4% of Georgia. It's a pretty small group in relationship, for example, to the Hispanics, which are twice as much. But actually in 2020, the amount of people that showed up for and to vote was about the same amount as the Hispanic vote, which was, I think, was it? Sorry, I'm moving around a little bit too much here. 2.6% of the vote was Hispanic vote, and 2.6 was actually Asian vote in 2020. And that's interesting because, it's a small group, so we can, talk about why that is. All right, so giving kind of that background in terms of who voted, we can then look at, what the result was. And this map from the New York Times was very interesting. It was a map that showed the change in terms of whether people voted more Democratic or more Republican than last time in 2016. And so, if it's blue, then it moved a little bit more in the Democratic direction. So it's important to realize that, if it's blue, it doesn't mean that they voted Democratic. It just means it moved more in the Democratic direction than the Republican direction. If it's red, it moved more in the, towards the Republican ticket than it did in 2016. And so they broke it down in terms of areas, in terms of regions, and high income regions, you saw a very big difference. And this is something that we've heard about with regards to the suburbs older populations also. What I find is interesting is the rural population, that even in the rural populations that there was a shift. It wasn't a big one, but it was a shift of 1% more in the Democratic direction. From what I've heard, one of the Trump campaign strategies was to really crank out the rural vote and to try to get the numbers really high in the rural areas, higher than last time, and to get more of these kind of dark red areas in the rural areas, so that they could counteract what they already knew was coming, which was more Democratic support in the suburbs and the cities. So that gets us to Carroll County, where it's considered rural, and we can see kind of what happened here. And if you look at the numbers, one of the things that really struck me was the amount of registered voters in Carroll County. It's very different than what we have in the state as a whole. So in 2016, only 62% of the eligible population was registered, but by 2020 it was 90%, 91%, which was much more close to the state average. And then if you look at the people that actually voted, it went down, from 77% to 65%. This is all based on the data that's provided to us by the Secretary of State. But it's down, but it's because there's so many more people registered now. And in fact, 22.6% more people voted in Carroll County this time around than they did last time. If you look at who voted and how they voted, very similar to what we see statewide. Trump voters generally preferred to vote more on the daytime in the election time than the Biden voters. A bigger difference here between the mail-in votes, but again, very, very significant preference for just kind of going in person and voting early. We know what the results were in Carroll County, and not surprisingly, Trump won the county. But again, what's interesting is that he did not win by the margins that I think the Trump campaign was banking on to counteract that push from the suburbs in Atlanta. And in Carroll County, in fact, we were one of those counties that shifted just a little bit more Democratic than in 2016. And so if you look at the actual percentage that voted for Trump and the Democratic ticket, Trump got 1% more this time around, but the Democratic ticket, Biden, got 1.7%, and largely they both gained because the Libertarian ticket, and there was no Green ticket. That's kind of what it came at the cost of. But you can see that the Democratic side got more votes. 25% more voters turned out for Trump in 2016, but 30% more voters turned out for Biden than they did for Clinton in 2016. And so that was that kind of counteracting of that rural kind of vote. I think that the Trump campaign was really hoping for, to counteract the city. The way it worked out here in Carroll County, we have really, it's kind of similar to what we see in the state. A little bit more of an increase in the Black vote, the same kind of decrease in the white vote. Hispanic vote was a little bit up, and the other vote was a little bit up as well. With regard to the young vote, what was really interesting, I thought, was that the young vote was down in Carroll County, even though it was up in the rest of Georgia. And so it went down a good chunk, really. And that kind of gets to this, looking at our county and kind of trying to figure out what happened. And so you see that this is again from that map. You see this trend that really more towards the eastern side of the county, voted more Democratic than in 2016. In areas where they voted more Republican than in 2016, it wasn't by a lot, except for this one little precinct here. Does anyone know what precinct that might be?
I do not know.
This precinct is the precinct of the University of West Georgia. So it was very interesting to look at what happened there. And I dug into it. And what basically happened was a number of things. First of all, the registered voters were down in this precinct by 8.6%. Total voter turnout was down by 23%. I mean, this is completely opposite of what was happening in the rest of the state. It's not a big precinct. I mean, in the end, it was only a little over 1,000 people that voted there, but it's nonetheless interesting to look at. And in 2016, it tilted Democratic, and this time around, it went for Trump by a little bit. I mean, you know, why did that happen? I think it's pretty clear. It's because of COVID and the fact that the students aren't on campus. And I think that basically there was just a lack of student turnout in this precinct of all the people that live, you know, that would be reporting to that precinct to vote, especially all the people that might be registered due to their having an address in the dorms or something like that. The dorms were complete. I mean, the whole campus was completely empty this semester. So I think that the results in that precinct, the reason why this is the result we see there is because of the lack of students. Okay, should I get into the contested election? Is that good?
I do have one thing to say.
Yeah.
And that is, Hannes, students this year, there was a concentrated push to let students know that they needed to vote in the county in which they are registered. And so I hate to say that the students didn't vote. I'd like to think that they voted at home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a possibility that the ones that maybe in 2016 didn't vote at all because they went, you know, to the wrong precinct. They might have gone to the UWG precinct and they were told they can't vote there. And if you're not in the right county, then you can't even submit a provisional ballot. So I think a lot of students lost their ability to vote in 2016. And those students, hopefully, they were part of that big push of more younger students or young people, basically, that voted. But we still have the fact that this precinct, for the people that would have voted here, we have the fact that it was much, much lower turnout. And I imagine that that must be the students that would have lived there, unless they somehow managed to change their address.
And that was the push. That was the push to get them to change their address to where it was that they would be. And I will say in 2016, the students did not understand that they needed to vote in the county in which they are registered. And we had over 100 and something provisional ballots that year. This year in 2020, we only had 13 ballots, provisional ballots at that particular precinct. Another thing is that precinct shares, the university shares with a very wealthy area around the country club.
Right.
So I'm not surprised that it wasn't, you know, that it was heavily Republican. So. Yeah,
no, I agree. You know, it's hard to know whether the students that would have otherwise would have voted there if they had been in the dorms, if they had changed their address. I mean, you do have to make an effort to do that. Otherwise, it's just what's on your license. But it would be interesting to try to dig into that a little bit. Hopefully they voted somewhere, and it's just not reflected here.
Yeah. The other thing is that in 2016, a lot of students, of course, wanted to vote for Obama. And now in 2020, they didn't really have that. Maybe some of the students felt like they didn't have a, you know, as they say, a dog in that hunt.
Right, right.
you know, so, but it's really significant that having, you know, Paul also works at that, and Deidre, of course, works at that, but I worked 2016 and 2020, and it was surprising how few students we had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was because of the COVID, because they didn't know where they were going to be.
Right. Yeah.
No.
I think that definitely played a role. So it's hard to know exactly, you know, without really digging into it, what happened. But
Deidre, did you have something to add?
Yes, I was going to add. I'm hoping that it had to do with a push. I know several of us went out and did presentations to, particularly a lot in athletics, like the entire football team, the entire soccer team, the entire basketball team, because we realized those are the students who are typically possibly a little bit more out of state. So we were doing those presentations for them in early September, encouraging them to get the absentee from their particular home state if they were not going to transfer and register in the state of Georgia. And several said that they were not, because they wanted to vote for somebody from the local elections back home. Whereas also another big push was encouraging our students to, if they weren't changing their registration to vote in Carroll County, to go home, particularly when we had early voting and that particular Saturday in most places, counties throughout Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Paul, did you have any addition to that information about that, our precinct? Or maybe perhaps we can't hear Paul. Well, anyway, go ahead, Hannes. I'm sorry.
Okay. Excuse me. All right. So I had once this whole thing started with the you know, the challenging of the election results, I started digging into that, and I spent like almost a whole day really looking through the law. And I'm not a legal expert, so, you know, this is if anyone knows more than I do, or if I get something wrong, please let me know. But this is what I was able to discern in terms of the guts, really, of the Electoral College. So what happens if an election is contested? So first of all, the Constitution stipulates that, you know, most people, I'm sure everyone here knows, that, you know, we don't vote by popular election. There's designated electors from each state that need to elect the president. And the number of those electors is based on how many representatives you have in the House of Representatives. The Constitution also stipulates that the state legislatures have the power over the manner in which electors are chosen. Okay, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. We can talk about it when I'm done. So since 1832, all state legislatures have opted to choose electors based on the party that wins the popular vote, right? In 1832, South Carolina appointed its electors that would then vote on the president through the legislature. And after that, that hasn't happened again, except with the exception of Colorado, which had just become a state and they didn't have time to organize an election. So really, this is the norm, is that we choose our electors through a popular vote. But what happens if a election is contested? And so here we get into history a little bit, and you know, we have a law now which is based on this very contested election that happened in 1876, when you know, you had Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden, and it was a close, really close election. And what ultimately happened, this was one of those cases where Hayes won the electoral vote, but he lost the popular vote. And there was a lot of pushback from the Democrats in the South. And ultimately, they submitted electors. They submitted multiple options for what the electors were, basically 2 slates of electors. So they had, so that the government got one Republican slate and one Democratic slate, and they kind of had to decide, and it became a real mess, and confusion ensued. Nobody really knew who was going to win that election, and then eventually they came to an agreement where Tilden said, he'd be okay with losing the election as long as, the Reconstruction of the South ended and the troops, the Northern troops, would pull out of the South. After that kind of fiasco, they came up with the Electoral Count Act, which was supposed to avoid anything like this from happening again, and it has now become code. So this is what it stipulates. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. First of all, it stipulates that state legislatures may not change procedures for choosing electors retroactively. So the legislators have the right to choose how they're going to choose their electors that then choose the president, but you can't have an election and then afterwards change it. So that's number one. So, state legislatures can't just unanimously say, we don't, abide by the popular vote, because by law, that's what they've decided is going to decide who the electors are. If there are controversies, states must settle the controversies. And then all controversies that are settled 6 days before the electors vote cannot be challenged anymore. That's basically, that's a done deal then. By December 8th, if, or this is in this case, December 8th, if they've, gone through the mediation process after that, it can't be challenged anymore. That's the so-called safe harbor deadline, December 8th. At that point, electors vote on the Monday after the second Wednesday. In this case, it's December 14th. Then the results have to be submitted to the federal government. That's the fourth Wednesday in December. That would be December 23rd in this case. And then Congress counts the votes on January 6th. And then the president-elect of the new term is sworn in. So that's basically what the law stipulates. It's a very complex and convoluted law, and lawyers say it's really hard to make a head or foot of it, but that's basically what comes out of it. So the question then is, what if controversies cannot be settled by the time that the electors vote, or by the time that the vote has to be submitted to the federal government? Well, the law states that, and this is a quote, whenever any state has held an election for the purpose of choosing electors and has failed to make a choice on the day prescribed by law, the electors may be appointed on a subsequent day on such a manner as the legislature of such state may direct. So in other words, there has to be some kind of assessment that a choice was not made. And I think that the idea behind this when they wrote the law was, if there's some kind of a natural disaster or some kind of a catastrophe that prevents people from being able to vote, and it prevents people from basically having a choice and having a will. But who would decide that? And so here, ultimately the question is, who would decide if there is a contestation, and that somehow the vote is not correct, or that the people's choice is not correct? Ultimately it's the courts that will decide this. This is almost, I would say almost 100% sure, but not quite, but almost 100% sure that courts will somehow decide how this would be resolved. And Bush versus Gore was a good precedent for this, because in that case, ultimately they decided that we have to stop the counting, because the counting has to be done in the entire state. You can't just do it in one county or two counties. It has to be done in the entire state. There's not enough time, and we have to meet the deadline. And so basically, this is what we found, and this is what we have to stick with. Sometimes the governors can step in as well. That's what we saw in Michigan, when, if somebody, if there's a board that refuses to certify an election, simply by not certifying the election can't make the whole election null and void. So in that case, a governor could theoretically step in if a court doesn't. And in the case of Michigan, the governor has the right to basically appoint a new person to the board if they're not doing, what the governor considers to be their job. But what happens if the court if the courts don't decide and don't step into the matter, or if they decide that voters have in fact not made a choice. So if for some reason they come to the conclusion that the election is so corrupt that it doesn't count. I mean, this is a real stretch here. I mean, there's so many ifs involved in this scenario, but just to kind of take it down that path to kind of see what some people are thinking about. If that happens, then state legislators could submit a slate of electors that contradicts the apparent result of the election. So that theoretically, at that point, that could happen. Now, this is interesting to note because there is a difference here between the state legislatures and the state governors. And if the state legislatures and the state governors are on the same page about what to do, if, for example, the courts have decided we're not going to, the election is not valid, it's really only in Georgia and Arizona where you have the legislatures and the governors of the same party. So they could theoretically submit a slate of electors that contradicts what apparently was the winner of the popular vote. If the courts, this is the biggest if, right? The 1% if the courts somehow say, go along with this. That would be Georgia and Arizona. Other than that, you have governors, Democratic governors in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so there would be a conflict in a sense between, what electors to send up to the federal government. And so in this case, you would get a situation similar to what we had in that Hayes-Tilden case back in the 1800s, when you had two slates of different electors being sent up to the federal government. So if state legislators did make that final choice and they send up their slates of electors, then according to the law, the newly elected Congress must vote on the slates to count on January 6th. So one of the questions I have that I haven't been able to find a great answer to is whether the Congress is obliged to vote yes if a single slate is submitted. So if, for example, Georgia or Arizona, and there's no indication that this is going to happen at all, but if they decided, the governor and the state legislature decided that they felt that the election was so tainted and the court didn't jump in, and they submitted a slate that was different from what appeared to be the popular winner of the vote, then it would be a single slate that they just send up to the Congress. And would they then would Congress be obliged to vote yes on that? Or could they say, no, we don't accept that? I don't know the answer to that. I couldn't find the answer to that. If you get two slates of electors, so basically the governor sends one and the state legislature sent one of different, Democratic and Republican, at that point, the Congress essentially has to decide which one's the right one. If that happens, in our case, we have a split House and Senate. It's the incoming House and Senate. So even if, the Georgian, goes blue and they get two senators, it would still be 50-50 and probably would be broken by the vice president, which at that time would still be, that's another thing I'm not sure, is it Biden or is it Pence? But in any case, there's the chance that there would be a difference in terms of what the House and the Senate, what side they would want to choose. And if that happens, there's uncertainty as we're kind of in uncharted water. Some people say then at that point it goes back to the governor because there's a call for the executive of the state to make the call. Others have argued that in that case that Vice President Pence would have the right to basically throw out the electors of this, the entire electors of that state, and they just don't count this time around. So again, the governorships by party would be very important here, because if it does get kicked back to the governors, in the case of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, that wouldn't be really a path this time for the Republican side. But really, the impossible task that really was there, or was maybe envisioned as somehow there for the Trump side to try to somehow wrestle this election back would be, or would have been, to get the Georgia and Arizona state legislatures and governors to overturn the election based on a perception that it was a fraudulent election. And in that case, they would send up one single slate of electors because they could agree on it. And then that would have gone, and if the Congress has to vote yes on a single slate, that would have gone to the Republican side in Georgia and Arizona. In Michigan and Wisconsin, maybe Pennsylvania, two slates of electors. And then in that case, you know, if that were true, that you could throw out, you know, the vice president could throw out the electors, they could just throw out Michigan and Wisconsin. In that case, Trump could have ended up ahead. I mean, it's such a long shot. It's so kind of in the realm of almost the impossible. But it's interesting to see how the news agencies, they don't say it's impossible. They always say it's just highly unlikely and almost impossible. But they always leave this little window open that maybe it could be pulled off. Of course, news is happening so fast. I was just looking right before this meeting. The Michigan Board of Electors has approved, certified the election in Michigan. And so really there's no recourse anymore. They're gonna meet that safe harbor date. And so all of this is, in a sense, is a moot point for this current election cycle. However, I think it's an interesting mind game to kind of walk through this to see that there are actually ways to contest an election and to try to take it into the courts and to kind of gum up the system to the point where state legislatures and governors could potentially submit something that really wasn't the will of the voters. And it's a bit frightening, I found, but again, it comes down to the courts. You know, something that I've felt since I've reviewed this is that we need a reform, really, of that old election counting law, so that there's much more clarity, basically, after an election and what happens, and there doesn't have to be so much interpretation by courts. Lastly, I should just note, if none of this can be decided and it's all up in the air, and you know, the law stipulates you have to have a new president, or, you know, a newly elected or selected president. You can't have a president that just kind of continues their term after the term is over. That's not allowed. Somebody else has to come in, or that person has to be somehow elected or selected through legal pathways. And in that case, it's really kind of confusing what happens then. Some people have said that the House of Representatives, you know, the leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would become president, but others have said no, that's not the case, because she's, you know, the whole election would be considered void, and she would essentially have also been part of that election, and so she wouldn't really count because she's up for election. So the most reasonable sources I could find would say, in fact, that it would be the president of the Senate, who is currently Chuck Grassley, that then would have to be sworn in if nobody could come to an agreement on what's happening. So yeah, that's it. That's the kind of crazy scenario.
Can I ask a question about that? You said that the newly elected legislature, Congress, has to vote on the 20th or on the 6th of January. So if that's the case, why would Pence be the one to preside over that? Yeah,
you know, that's a question that I could not find an immediate answer to. It's a question that I had as well. In the article that I was reading, it was noting a number of law scholars that were making this argument that maybe it would be Pence. I guess Pence is not elected, so basically he's still in power until the 20th, and so he's not part of he was not part of the election, and so in some ways he would still be considered to be the de facto vice president, even though they have a new Congress. I don't know, you know, this is something that I guess you know, the political scientists would know. I mean, if I don't know if this has ever happened before, but basically what we're looking at is if Congress decides to make law between the time that they're sworn in, which is, I guess, January 6th or something like that, and the time that the new president comes in, if they decide to make a law and it's a 50-50 vote, I would imagine it would be Pence that could break that vote in between January 6th and January 20th.
Wow.
But this is not supposed to give anyone heartaches or you know, keep them up at night. I mean, there are just so many ifs in this type of scenario that you know, I really think that there's absolutely nothing that in this case could change what, you know, what is quite apparent of kind of who won the election. But it might have been different, I think, if Biden had won simply through one state, if there was just one state that was in play, then all of this would have been much easier to pull off.
Do you have any thoughts on the economics of the cost of the different recounts that are going on in some of the states that are being contested now? All of those recounts are not voluntary, are they? And I was wondering, is it us, the taxpayers, who are paying for those different things? And I'm thinking about counties who are already strapped in terms of economics, as well as being in the pandemic with people either being out of work or maybe their hours are reduced, which is why we're seeing more people who might be considered middle class in some of the food lines that I've seen.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't know the details across the country. It's a state by state kind of thing. I know that in Wisconsin, they demand the campaign to pay for it. I know that in the case of Georgia, that audit, as they called it when they did the hand counting, that was something that was ordered by the state, and that is being paid for by the state. And now I do also know that in Georgia, that that the candidate has a right to order another recount, which apparently is still supposed to happen, where they're going to run all the ballots through the machines this time, and that recount, apparently the candidate has a right to demand that, and the state again will pay for all of that. And so basically the taxpayers will pay for all of that in Georgia, and that's not the case in Wisconsin. I don't know what it is in other states.
Hannes, this is Helen. I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, so I've been following when the different states' deadlines for certification happen. Okay. And that, from what I understand from all of the legal stuff and all of the processes that you've been showing, and from what Trump's lawyers are trying to do, they're trying to stop the certifications legally as much as they can, because then after certification, it's much more difficult than to disallow those electors. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So it's a kind of a cheap way of trying to do it, and ultimately it would be a failed way of doing it, I think. But the idea is to not allow for the certification, and in the hopes that somehow enough doubt will arise regarding the election that the state legislature feels somehow emboldened to say, you know, the election doesn't count, and they're going to put their own electors forward. Now, it should be noted that no state legislators have said that they plan to do this or that this is a good idea. And so what it seems like really is just that there are a couple of you know, really hardcore people that are in some of these certification boards, and they have decided that they didn't want to certify the results because they weren't satisfied by what by what they saw as irregularities. Now the irregularities, all of the ones that have been proven, are way too small to change anything in that state. Nonetheless, the hope is that somehow to gum up the system and to prevent it from kind of going through the process. But ultimately, in Michigan was where we got the closest to this, and so if the board, they met today, if both Republicans had said, we're not going to certify, and that didn't happen, one of them, right. I don't know if both of them, one of them said that he was going to certify, so everything went through. But if both of them had said no, it would have immediately gone to the courts, and the courts would have looked at it, and they would have, in 99.9% chance, they would have looked at it and said, well, there's no evidence of widespread fraud, so the will of the people has to be met, and that's your job to certify that, and they would have forced them to certify it. The other option is for the governor to basically just fire them and appoint somebody else, which would be a right. political move.
I read that too.
Yep. Yeah, and so that would be an option too. And they're trying to get this all gummed up before that kind of safe haven date, at which point, December 8th, at which point, if everything is certified and there is no, there's no challenge, then it's basically a done deal.
Does Trump realize that?
Yeah, I think he does, because today, just right before our meeting, I saw that the GSA has opened up Biden's ability to start the transition. So
really, I hadn't heard that. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Hans, with that announcement, I heard that also, or on the news also. Would that mean that they would double back on having this third recount for Georgia?
I don't think so, sadly. Okay. I wish that was the case, but I just quickly read the news item right before the meeting started, and I think that Trump immediately tweeted that that basically he's allowing for this transition to start. But that basically the fight goes on, and he's going to keep fighting for the good fight, and he's convinced that he's going to win. So it sounds like they're, and especially if it doesn't cost him anything, it's doubtful that that he'll pull back. That's just my personal opinion. But if it doesn't cost him anything, and he's tweeting stuff like that, then it sounds like he's still somehow committed to this idea that somehow it can still be turned around.
Anybody else?
I have questions about the statistics on the votes as well. I mean, one of the things I found was interesting is that Georgia has 9.9% of the population is Hispanic, and yet only 2.1% of the Hispanics actually are only 2.1% of the vote is a Hispanic vote, which is the same as the Asian vote was 2.1% this time, and they only make up 4.5% of the entire population. And it seems like there's a pretty big demographic group in Georgia that could have quite a bit of influence on the elections if, of course, they are allowed to vote. I don't know, I that was one of the things I thought was interesting.
I wondered if that was the case, having to do with immigration and people protecting their families, people who are waiting on citizenship, if it has not gone through yet, whereas other family members having citizenship, and then all that you continue to see in the news about ICE coming to invade certain homes or places where that particular population may frequent. So I just wonder, I don't know or have any statistical information if those were definite barriers of people just trying to protect themselves, and not being able to, even though they may have wanted to participate as fully in the election process.
So
There are
you're
many
saying voter intimidation.
and there are many issues, things that go in place. People who have no documentation, and I have had the pleasure of being able to get about 37 residents to become citizens, but some of them were very hard to convince to become citizens because of the citizenships test. They don't knowing the English language fully, but now that it is going to be changing and it is going to be a little bit more difficult to pass that citizenship test, we need to do more citizenship classes and do that and help fix that problem. And the other part is that in Latin America, being part of the election portion of there's not that much belief. And I have spoken with many people and they have talked to me about, see, it's happening here too. What happens in Latin America, it's happening in the United States, what I had mentioned to you before. And the lack of participation, because we have a lot of youth that have become, that they were born here, and they have the opportunity of voting, but for one reason or the other, they did not go to the polls.
So fear, do you think, was a factor?
Yes.
In that? So.
Yes.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Hannes. This has been very, very interesting. We're going on. We've been doing this for 45 minutes, I think, or longer. So, any rate, thank you so much, and we'll get this, put in recording and put it on Facebook, and send you a copy of it also. So, thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you so much.
That's excellent.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.